By 1945, the Soviets were rampaging toward Berlin. The Allies had invaded Normandy, and Germany had entered a death spiral. Still, the suffering and death continued as the Nazis clung to power to the bitter end. In 1940, German forces bombed Coventry, England for 11 hours, destroying so much of that beautiful old city that Coventrieren became the German slang for to destroy as badly as Coventry. And it wasn't just Coventry. London was famously bombarded by the Blitz for 57 consecutive nights. By the end of the war, though, it would be German cities that would be totally destroyed from the air. As early as 1940, industrial cities in the Rhine and Ruhr River valleys took major hits from the Royal Air Force. As German defenses weakened, Allied bombers got more ambitious with their strikes. In 1943, Allied Operation Gomorrah reduced much of Hamburg and its strategically important shipyards to ash.
No civilized country can wage a war without its cities. If we burn down their cities, then we have won.
By February 1945, it was Dresden's turn. This beautiful Baroque city had managed to survive virtually unscathed throughout the war, but 3 nights of incendiary bombing leveled it, killing as many as 250,000 people.
Of course, if it were to happen today, it would certainly be regarded as a war crime.
There's a lot of Monday morning quarterbacking today as to why the Allies specifically chose Dresden. The main culprit seems to be for the shock value. Well, that part worked. The images of the bombed out buildings are still horrific to this day. The real reason is less conspiracy laden. You see, Dresden was an important train hub and they did have arms factories there. So the real conspiracy should be, how did Dresden make it until 1945 before being bombed? As the Soviets liberated German-occupied territory, the extent of the horrors the Nazis had inflicted became more and more clear. The Red Army took on a savage momentum as they seized the capitals of Eastern and Central Europe. By 1945, they would be in Berlin. The Germans feared the Red Army's well-earned reputation for cruelty. The Soviets were driven to exact revenge for the countless murders German forces had committed as they charged across the Western Soviet Union. With the German war machine collapsing, there was no one to stop them.
Stalin had reportedly allowed his soldiers to do anything for 3 days as a reward for taking Berlin.
It wasn't just the Germans who suffered under the Russian invasion. Looting and lethal violence against civilians were rampant across every area the Soviets liberated. German society had been traumatized by food shortages after World War I. That had more to do with a British blockade, but that's really for another video. Anyway, the Nazi state capitalized on this fear by promising there would be food for everyone going forward. That's what they said anyway. The reality was somewhat different. In the late 1930s, so much of the German economy was devoted to preparations for the coming war that finding enough food was already becoming a problem. Nazi propaganda kicked in hard with suggestions for budget and supply-stretching dishes like whole grain bread and one-pot stews. By 1941, German homemakers were increasingly relying on vegetables like cauliflower to fill their families' bellies, and poor Germans had begun foraging for wild food. The German establishment knew there was a problem. One reason for the invasion of the Soviet Union that year was the need to plunder Eastern European farms and their products. Ration allowances plummeted as the war continued, and meat was scarce in cities during the winter of 1943 to 44. Rural people suffered less, and later, than city dwellers. Berliners resorted to cooking with beet leaves and nettles, making meatless meatballs as supplies disappeared. Inflation made shortages even worse, with prices high even when products were available. By 1945, Germany was siphoning a significant portion of its food supply from places like occupied Denmark, which had fallen early in the war and hadn't suffered the hardships of invasion. Anyone German authorities considered lesser fared even worse. I know this is going to be shocking, but at the beginning of the war, rations for Jews were set lower than everybody else, and prisoners in concentration camps lived at the edge of starvation, unless their particular skill was considered important enough to the regime. And in case you feel compelled to go off in the comments denying the Holocaust, don't waste your breath. The Nazis themselves owned the killing. They weren't ashamed in the least. In fact, SS bigwig Adolf Eichmann himself estimated that they murdered around 6 million Jews, and the Nazis were notoriously good at record keeping, so that's where the 6 million number came from, the Nazis themselves. As Germany retreated, they faced a massive problem. The ruined towns, the terrorized civilians, and above all, the extermination camps were about to be discovered, and Germany's war crimes would be revealed to the world. The Holocaust was not wholly secret beforehand. Allied governments were aware of the camps, but the Nazis claimed those reports were anti-German propaganda. They even went so far as to stage a happy visit to the Theresienstadt camp for the Red Cross in 1944, complete with a children's opera. Germany had dedicated much of its governmental apparatus around the liquidation of Jewish populations in Europe, along with other minorities including Roma, queer people, and the disabled. And this murder machine didn't stop until the absolute end. In 1944, Nazi Germany occupied its ally Hungary in order to prevent the Hungarian government from striking a deal with the advancing Red Army. The German occupiers still found the time and manpower to do their campaign of evil. It targeted the Hungarian Jews, now that their government could no longer protect them from persecution. Over 400,000 Hungarian Jews were shipped to labor or extermination camps over a few weeks that spring. By 1945, the fronts were collapsing, and the Germans were frantic to conceal evidence of the camps. Inmates were driven out of Auschwitz on forced marches, where they were shot if they lagged behind or simply froze to death in the Polish winter. Others were left to starve and brave the elements in open railroad cars. Allied troops in the West found 28 railroad cars full of corpses at Dachau. Mass graves were disinterred in order to destroy the bones to further conceal the magnitude of the Nazi slaughter. The enormity of the Holocaust led to the coining of the term genocide, and its definition was ratified by the UN in 1948. The militarization of German civilian life and the army-like structure of the Hitler Youth meant that when manpower began to dwindle in 1943, Germany had a ready supply of child soldiers to turn to. Hitler Youth members, who would have been under 18, were conscripted into units that fought against the Soviets on the Eastern Front and against the Normandy invasion in northern France. In October 1944, the Volkssturm, or People's Storm, was created, a militia made up of every male from 16 to 60 who wasn't otherwise fighting. This included men injured earlier in the war and sent home. The militias were tasked with defending their own areas from invasion, but a lack of training and weapons meant that the numbers of casualties and deserters were astronomical. Finally, as Berlin itself watched the Red Army draw near, children of both sexes were pulled out of school, armed with whatever was available, and pointed at the advancing Soviets. Shortly before his final retreat into his bunker, Hitler met with a group of boys, all set to defend the fatherland with their young lives. These children received little training from the Germans and even littler mercy from the Soviets. Their deaths served as a final indictment of the perversity of the Nazi state. It would sacrifice Germany's entire future for a few more days in power. As the Soviets dismantled the Nazi infrastructure in the East, German forces were faced with the problem of the POWs held in camps along the Red Army's path. If liberated, these POWs could be repatriated and returned to the war effort. And with Germany already buckling under a manpower shortage, the last thing it wanted was to let the Allies help themselves to reinforcements. To that end, they forced prisoners of war to march west across Central Europe in the winter and spring of 1945. That winter was frigid and unusually snowy. The prisoners were already weakened by captivity. POW camps were distinct from labor or extermination camps, but conditions were by no means good. Diarrhea from contaminated water further weakened the men. Medical care was scarce at best, and some columns of marching men were mistaken for German troops and attacked by Allied planes. In all, some 80,000 of the 250,000 men held in German POW camps were forced to march west under horrific conditions, with death tolls difficult to calculate given the circumstances. During the end stages of World War II, some of the newly liberated nations began deporting their ethnically German residents. This was most common in the East. German communities were cleared out of Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, Yugoslavia, the Soviet Union, including its conquests in the Baltic states, and those parts of Eastern Germany that were to be resettled and reassigned to Poland. Even the Netherlands got in on the act, purging 3,600 Germans in Operation Black Tulip. The ethnic cleansing continued until 1950. 2 million ethnic Germans were deported to work in the Soviet Union as a form of national reparations. An estimated 2 million of the 12 to 14 million Germans expelled died, either directly from violence or from complications like hunger or illness. They also faced violence, looting, and denial of basic services. The expulsion of the Germans would be the largest act of ethnic violence in Europe between the time of the Holocaust and the atrocities that occurred during the breakup of Yugoslavia in the 1990s. As the Nazi project collapsed around them, many Germans chose to die by suicide rather than face the occupation. Some murdered their loved ones in what they considered an act of mercy. There were actually more civilian deaths by suicide than there were Nazi officials. Everyday people under enormous duress from the strain of the long, harrowing war ended their struggles rather than face the abuses they feared at the hands of the marauding Soviet army. These deaths took place across gender, class, age, and seemingly all other societal lines. The victims shared only their despair. The Soviet army was particularly notorious for sexual violence against civilians, but US and French forces, particularly colonial units from Morocco, were also guilty of the assaults of civilian German women, many of whom were victimized more than once. Not even Hitler and his inner circle were able to insulate themselves from the war in the final weeks. Hitler and crew moved to the infamous bunker in Berlin in January 1945, where they cowered as the hopeless war ground on and Allied and Soviet armies advanced on the capital. By late April, Soviet troops were in Berlin itself. Unable to deny the inevitable any longer, Hitler wrote his will before marrying longtime mistress Eva Braun. The newlyweds had a wedding breakfast with some of their fellows in the bunker. Hitler's secretary left the meal early, as the vibe was unsurprisingly grim. Later that morning, news reached the bunker that Mussolini, his mistress, and some of their hangers-on had been hung in northern Italy, their bodies strung up in the public square and mutilated by an angry mob. Their fate reportedly terrified Hitler, who sprung into action. He had his dogs poisoned, then gave a spare cyanide capsule to the secretary. Braun gave her a fur coat, which she may have liked better. Hitler and Braun then died by suicide, and the remaining occupants of the bunker either followed suit or slipped out to take their chances with the Soviets. Magda Goebbels, wife of Hitler's chief propagandist, committed a final atrocity on her way out. She poisoned 6 of their 7 children, at least one by force, before taking her own life. In spring 1943, the Allies made it their goal to force the Axis powers into unconditional surrender. This would give the victors the freedom to do whatever they liked with their enemies. The original plan was to strip Germany of its industrial base, divide Prussia, and to detach various German territories, then give them to its neighbors. There was also a plan to partition Germany. Much of these things came to be, mostly due to squabbles between the Western Allies and the Soviets. But the Germans lucked out. Former President Herbert Hoover visited Germany in 1947, and upon seeing the widespread hardship, convinced the US government to rebuild a stronger Germany capable of feeding its own. It didn't hurt that the Allies soon realized that an industrialized Germany could better serve European manufacturing needs, and if needed, help defend against Soviet encroachment into Western Europe. The Germans were forced to swallow one final bitter pill: denazification. High-ranking Nazis were removed from public office, and Nazi leaders were put on trial, and in some cases, executed. Details of the trials were widely publicized to expose the depths of Nazi depravity to the world and discredit their ideology. Everyday people were also forced to confront the reality of Nazi crimes and the Holocaust through psychological denazification. Germans were forced to look at images and footage of the Holocaust, to visit mass graves, and to bury victims, in the effort to force them to confront the horrors that had been committed in their names.